Good evening, good morning. Welcome to week 4 of PSSL 6240, Political Violence and Terrorism. Just want to start off with a couple of announcements before we get started. The Adobe Connect session that I intended to do for this upcoming Thursday in week 4, I'm going to push back to the start of week 5 to Monday. I got called back on a work emergency. I have to actually travel to Fort Campbell, Tennessee, fill in for someone that had a family issue, and I'll be traveling on the road that Thursday, and I will not have access to internet or to Adobe. So we're pushing that back to the following Monday, and we're going to do the same thing, 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So if there's an issue with that, please let me know. And in that Adobe Connect session, I'll talk more about detail next week, but again, similar format as last time. I'm going to open up some questions, some discussion, and then talk about the paper 2, which will be due that following Sunday. So please be in that Adobe Connect session so you can get the guidance for paper 2. So review of last week. I think we had some pretty good discussions on the discussion board. Road to 9/11 first. I think we hit a lot of the discussion points. But the points that I'm not 100% sure, I tried to prompt a little bit to come out. There were 2 questions. First is the short history and long history debates. I think the Road to 9/11 documentary kind of gives us long history and goes back to even before the colonial time period, back to Wahhabism, back to the founding of Islam, and they go through that history all the way up to 9/11. The Zakaria article that I assigned gave a little bit of the short history, that we don't look at colonialism, we don't look at years, 100, 200 years to establish the social phenomenon of what happened on 9/11. We look more short term. We look at what happened after 1967. We look at globalization and other worldwide trends. So that kind of that short history, long history piece is something that I expect you to know and kind of debate and take a position on one side or another, or a combination of both. The second question I ask is, I want you to kind of start thinking like social scientists, and what I mean by that is, you're trying to diagnose a problem here. The problem is anti-Americanism, anti-Westernism in the Arab world running up to and right after 9/11. Why did that happen? And from a social science perspective, it's like diagnosing a patient that has a disease. You look at the factors and you look at the causes and you try and determine a judgment. If you want to say that colonialism had a contributing factor to 9/11, which is what the Road to 9/11 documentary states, as a social scientist, then you look at other places that have been colonized. India was colonized. East Asia was colonized. Africa was colonized. However, they don't have the same societal problems or American anti-Western problems as you see in the Arab world. So it's not like you eliminate that as a factor, but it's not really the primary factor. You look at religion. Some people, we talked about religion being a factor in the Road to 9/11, and some of you made that discussion. However, there is Muslims. Islam is a huge religion that comes from all the way from North Africa to East Asia, and there's very, very progressive Muslim societies in Malaysia and in India and in some parts of Africa. So if you're going to say Islam had a role in it, you have to counter those arguments that say there's Islam everywhere. Support to dictatorships. That's what the Road to 9/11, and even Zakaria makes that argument, that our support to dictatorships in Saudi Arabia and Egypt were breeding grounds for 9/11. It led to the causal factors for 9/11. However, the United States and the West supports dictatorships across the world. We've supported dictatorships in South Korea and in Chile and in Argentina. And they didn't have that anti-Americanism that we saw again in the Arab world. So I want you, again, this is something you should look at for this chapter as well as for future sections in this course, is to ask the question, is to look at these problems from the social scientist perspective. You know, what is this a problem? You test the theory, and then you make a hypothesis, or you make a conclusion based on that theory. So, you know, those are kind of the two takeaways I wanted, again, to take away from the Road to 9/11 piece. The second was the terrorism finance chapter. I think I agree with Josh. Napoletti definitely comes this from a very left-wing, for lack of a better word, left-wing viewpoint. It's controversial. It's not everything that she says is controversial, but she opens up her arguments with that. And I think that might take away a little bit from her argument. The one thing I would just address is that she made that speech back in 2006, 2007 time period when the Iraq War was at its nadir, where I would argue that American viewpoints in the world were at its nadir, and that might be a reflection of that. The one thing I want to also bring up is, and you're going to see this in the next week, you know, a terrorist group, she says that terrorism groups are fundraising financiers that occasionally kill people. That's what a terrorist group is. And that forces terrorist groups to demise, because instead of being these holier-than-thou organizations, they suddenly become very money-centric. And they often become criminal enterprises. And she alludes to that in her lecture. The one thing I'd like to, again, the case study that might alter your viewpoint is Hezbollah. Hezbollah has been around for 30 years, and they never had, and even though they have a fundraising capacity, they always had steady amounts of dollars coming from their state sponsors, specifically Iran. So they never had to do the ugly things necessary that maybe the ETA or the Red Brigades or the FLN had to do regarding money. They were never really cash strapped. So if you're not cash strapped, then you don't have to, for lack of a better word, pimp out your yourself to get money so you can conduct terrorist attacks. So that's one thing to look at when we're looking at state sponsors of terrorism. That Hezbollah, that there's others out there that if they have a constant supply of financing, particularly from a state, they don't need to reorient their policies. And then the final thing that she doesn't mention, that's alluded to in the PowerPoint slides, is the principal agent problem. And what this manifested itself particularly in Al-Qaeda around 2005, 2006, where Osama bin Laden would, in order to decentralize his organization, he would give money, and then instead of dictating it like you were in the government or the military, he would give money to his subordinates and let them spend it. And this led to a lot of Al-Qaeda money becoming spent on a lot of frivolous things, particularly in some of their Al-Qaeda affiliates in Iraq and in some of London. The centerpiece, Al-Qaeda core, in order to, because it was decentralizing, had to loosen the purse strings, and this led to the money not being used as efficiently as possible by the subordinates. This happened again with Al-Qaeda, and it's relevant a lot when you look at the cache that was the information brought in after the Osama bin Laden raid. So that's something again to consider when terrorism financing, how a decentralized group might be harder to find from a counterterrorism perspective, but certainly the money isn't being used as efficiently. So just previewing next week, I'm going to be honest with you, the readings are pretty thick. They're very good readings, and they're accurate readings, and they're definitely important for the terrorist literature, but they're thick. They take a little while to get through them. The first reading first section deals with terrorism adaptation, and you have the RAND article on terrorist adaptation that goes into four groups: Shinrikyo, Hezbollah, IRA, and then the left-wing environmental terrorist groups. And one thing we're going to be asking is why certain groups succeed. Why do certain groups succeed? Why do certain groups fail? And the Rand article goes into detail how the groups adapt, how they react in certain cases. I talk in the lecture on what I call is kind of this cycle of violence, and you'll see it in the lecture where a terrorist group goes through these certain decision points, certain pivot points that lead to its success, like Hezbollah, Hamas, or its failure, like Sikh separatism and the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. I try and determine those pivot points or those decision points that kind of force them to go off the rails, and that's what I want to look at on these terrorist groups. So for your discussion section for your first part of week 4 on terrorism adaptation, what I want you to do is pick a group, one of the groups that it's mentioned, and then go into detail and talk. Okay, why did it succeed? Why did it fail? What were those key pivot points? What did the group do? How did they adapt to certain pressures from the counter-terrorist organization? One thing that I would recommend you do is you look at, so part 1 is what I assign. Part 2, the Rand article part 2, and if you Google it, there's a second part to it, and it goes in detail on each group. So what I would recommend you do is, from part 1, you choose a group that you like, and then look at part 2, which goes in detail in that group. And then on the discussion section, you ask those questions that I've laid out before, that I've laid out. And based on what I see in the discussion, I'm going to ask one of you or someone from each group, Shinrikyo, Hezbollah, IRA, and the left-wing groups, the left-wing environmental groups, I'm going to ask someone to talk about their discussion posts at the next Adobe Connect session. Again, I think this is a pretty critical case study analysis, and I would like you to talk about it in the discussion section, share it with your fellow students, and then talk about it at the Adobe Connect session next Monday. So yeah, I think it's imperative to go through those individual case studies and for the discussion section to master one of those groups. So that's the first part of next week, or this upcoming week. The second part is probably my favorite subject, WMD terrorism. I've assigned the movie Dirty War, HBO film that came out in 2006. It's a pretty entertaining flick. Something I would not recommend you see with your children if they're below 12 years old. But it's still a pretty entertaining flick, and it's something that, for the most part, I'll talk about it next week. There are parts that are not scientifically accurate, but it's definitely a good introduction to the dirty bomb threat, as well as how a city can respond to the dirty bomb threat. And for those of you who work as first responders in that capacity, feel free to jump in on the next Adobe Connect session to talk about that in detail. So you'll watch the movie and then you listen to the lecture. It'll give a pretty good overview of the WMD terrorism threat. It'll also do some mythbusters. I think the WMD terrorism threat in a lot of cases is overhyped, and if it's overhyped, you will have things like the Iraq War. We went to war in Iraq because of WMD terrorism, because of the fear of WMD terrorism. When if anyone had done even rudimentary analysis on some of the claims made by the intelligence agencies, by certain policymakers, I don't think we would have gone to war, or at least the march to war might have been diffused in some cases. So I start off with some mythbusters that are still relevant today. There's a lot of WMD myths pertaining to Iran and Syria that oftentimes make the media rounds. And then I'll talk about Shinrikyo and Al-Qaeda, compare and contrast. And you will have read the Center for New American Security article on Shinrikyo, so you should be pretty well versed in that. And the question we'll ask is, why has Aum Shinrikyo conducted WMD while Al-Qaeda has not? And that's a pretty good illustrative case study. And then I'll go in depth into Aum Shinrikyo. And then the second case study is the Rajneeshis, which many of you probably don't remember, happened in 1983, and it's before the anthrax attacks in 2001. That was the first biological attack against the U.S. homeland. And then that will lead into the paper. The paper I'll talk more in detail next week at the Adobe Connect section, but what I'm looking at the paper is I'm giving you 2 case studies. Choose one of the case studies, write a 1,200 to 1,500 word essay, and I'm going to be actually really strict on that 1,500 word limit because I want this to be a very tightly focused policy paper. But you have 2 case studies, and the best way to look at it is, imagine you work either in Congress or you're the Homeland Security Advisor for a governor. He reads one of the articles assigned, and one's about Syria and sarin, and he reads the article, and then he goes to you and says, write me a memo that either says that this is a threat or this is not a threat, and back it up with your analysis. That's how the paper is going to work for the second iteration here for paper 2, and I'll talk more in detail next week. So with that being said, if there's any questions or problems, particularly with moving the Adobe Connect session, or there's any just problems in general, please give me an email, or we can Skype, and I look forward to your answers on this discussion board.